So welcome. My name is Devin Lau. I am the Associate Director for Yale Center Beijing, based here in New Haven, as is our speaker today. But we're very happy to welcome all of you joining us, primarily, I'm guessing, from China, but from wherever you are in the world. Good to see you. And today's topic, as I was just discussing with our speaker today, is on Celadon and ceramics from China, and this beautiful book that just came out from Yale University Press. And so we'll be talking about the book and, of course, many of the ceramics that can be found at the Yale University Art Gallery. And we hope to welcome many of you to the art gallery at some point to see for yourself. Um, Let me introduce our speaker and then we can jump right in. Um, so Denise Lady is the Ruth and Bruce Dayton Curator of Asian Art at the Yale University Art Gallery. She currently serves um, at the art gallery, but prior to that, she served as the Brooke Russell Astor Curator of Chinese Art Emerita at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as in curatorial positions at the Asia Society in New York and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She is endlessly fascinated by the development and movement of technologies, ideas, and images within and between Asian cultures, a focus of her study of ceramics today, as well as between these centers and those in Africa, Europe, and the Americas. In addition to curating exhibitions, she's published and lectured widely, exploring topics, especially in Buddhist art, as well as Chinese and other Asian ceramics and East Asian lacquer. She's published many books and curated many exhibitions. So if you ever get a chance to hear her talk, she's a fantastic speaker and full of fascinating stories. And so I consider it a great privilege to be able to have her here today joining us. And I'm looking forward to the talk.
Thank you. Okay, should I just start?
Yes, go for it. And so the talk will
Okay.
be in the probably around the 30-40 minute range, and then we'll have a Q&A as
Yes,
well.
absolutely. Let's see if we can finally manage to get this thing to work.
All right.
Okay, is it working for everybody?
Looks good.
Okay, so again, thank you all for taking the time. I guess in the evening for some of you, very early in the morning for all of us. So this is a publication and a talk that's actually rooted in Yale's collection and surprisingly is tied to the Yale mission in China. Because when I first came to Yale and my mandate was to review the collection and to double the space in the Yale University Art Gallery, I was doing what anybody in my position would do, which is really start looking around at what was in the collection. There were a lot of ceramics that I was not familiar with. So I did the safe curatorial thing. I put the objects that I understood best on view. And then during COVID, I went back to these ceramics and started to try to figure out what they are. Most of the funky ceramics were actually collected in Hunan in the 20s and the 30s by a man named John Hadley Cox, who was based in Southwest China because of the Yale mission to China. And it turned out that Yale could tell this very, very interesting story about green glazed wares because it had things in its collection that are not in other Western museums. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what these things were. And just to give you a little background, we're in the 9th to the 14th century. And you have to imagine China as a place totally dotted with kilns, both in the north and in the south, with large complexes and small individual places, making an astonishing range of ceramics. And you also have to think about the fact that China has massive rivers and waterways that link it to the East China Sea and the South China Sea. So there's this flow of water across China that allows for ceramics both to be made, but also to move to ports and be traded. And interestingly enough, from the perspective of ceramic history, we are going to be in South China, not North China for this story, but from the perspective of ceramic history, we all, from the perspective of Chinese history, that makes more sense. We all think, I think, of the great Yangtze River as the divider between North and South. From the perspective of ceramic history and from the perspective of geology, it's actually a mountain range just south of the Huai River, which is known as the Qingling Mountain Range and also the Nanshan Mountain Range. And north of that, the clays that people have to work with are true mineral clays. South of that, the clays that people have to work with are more apt to be volcanic or igneous rock. And interestingly enough, that has had a startling impact on both the ceramic history of South China and the development of ceramic technology in China, because this kind of rock needs to be fired at a higher temperature than many other kinds of clay. And as a result of this, South China invented a series of glazing. So what happened initially, we think, is there was a pot in a kiln, and it was being fired with wood, probably, possibly cold, and ash would settle on the ceramic it was being fired, and it would make a pattern. And by the sort of late Bronze Age, early Han Dynasty, they started making those glazes very deliberately. So the glaze that I'm showing you on your left is a deliberate glaze, which was made to cover the top of the pot. And you can see that it's a little inconsistent. It didn't cover the entire glaze. It pools in places. It drips in places. And it's a precious and rare enough technology that they're not doing it for the entire pot. By the time you get right before the Tang Dynasty, so from the 4th to the 6th century, this technology has developed further. And you can see it in the small jar on your right. The glaze covers more of the body. It's more even in its coloring, but it's still a little mottled. In the Tang Dynasty, particularly in Zhejiang province, and towards the end of the Tang, they managed to push this technology a little bit further. And several things happened at once. Ceramics became part of a broader culture. People started writing poetry to them. People started assessing them in literature. So you get the beginning of connoisseurship. And people started really judging them aesthetically. Were they good? Were they beautiful? Did they represent a high technical moment? Some of that, but not all of it, has to do with the rise of tea drinking and formalized tea drinking. And so we're thinking of the classic of tea in this context. And some of it has to do with the fact that they just got better at making ceramics. So the two pieces that I'm showing you on the screen now are yueware. They're made from Zhejiang province. And they're one of the wares that was the subject of poetic writing and aesthetic writing and scholarship as early as the late Tang Dynasty. People talk about the beauty of the color, which is green, and also the strength of the shaping, so the glory of the shapes. So I'm showing you two pieces here that were excavated in 1987 under the base of a pagoda at Famansa in North China. And these pieces literally solved one of the great mysteries in Chinese art history, because in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, people had discovered early sources in China where they were talking about something called secret colorware, which gives you a sense of how people were responding to ceramics, by the way. And there was tons and tons of scholarly arguments as whether or not the yue wares from Zhejiang were these famous secret colored wares, or if there was something else that people haven't found and identified yet. When they excavated beneath the pagoda in 1987, they found 14 examples of these green glazed wares that had been imported to the north from the south. And they also found an 1873 stele that explicitly identified them as secret color or yue wares. So to give you a sense of the impact on these ceramics in Asia at the time, as late as the 14th century in Japan, people were still alluding to the creation of this ceramic technology in China in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. And if you look at the two pieces on the screen, you can see that they're very, very carefully potted, that the glaze covers the entire or almost the entire body, and that it's a delicate shade of green, and it isn't running or mottled anymore. It's just a beautiful, beautiful ceramic. And we know from a tiny little fragment in the Yale University Art Gallery, I'm going to go back a minute, that they made these in different levels of quality. So the pieces that were found at Famansu often have these marks on the bottom, which are spurs or called spurs. And that tells us that they were stacking the ceramics in one another in order to fire them, which is efficient and makes it possible to make more ceramics. This fragment at the Yale University Art Gallery, which I suspect was once a cup and probably based on a silver shape, was not fired using spurs. So this is the inside of the cup with this wonderful dragon. And this is the outside where you can see these two small, I'm assuming they're ducks, chasing each other in a very tiny pattern. There were no spurs here, which means that this piece, even though it's damaged and broken, was probably placed in a sagger, an individual clay container, and fired, and would have been seen, particularly if it was complete, which I admit it isn't, as a more expensive or elegant item because it took more work to make it. And again, if you look at it, the glaze it's beautifully shaped, beautifully decorated, and the glaze is completely controlled and pretty much covers the entire vessel. And that was sort of the development of technology in South China that allowed ceramics to become global trade items. For reasons that we don't understand, the source of green glazed wares, which was Zhejiang, moved from the sort of north of the province to the south of the province, somewhere around the 10th century, and they started making what are called lungtren wares. It's absolutely impossible, I think, for us today to understand the extent of the industry at Lungtren. By the Southern Song, there were probably 500 kiln complexes. So that could have been as many as 1,500 kilns, employing a ton of people in this very elaborate infrastructure that included supervisors, potters, designers, glaze specialists, people who sourced wood, people who ran kilns, people who found the clay, people who refined the clay, people who were responsible for trading things. And lungtren wares, which I'm showing you 3 examples of right now, were really the first Chinese ceramics to explode on the scene. So both Yue wares and lungtren wares have been found as far west as Fustat, which is just south of present-day Cairo, and as far east as Japan. So you're essentially looking at a trading network from the east coast of Africa to the Japanese islands. And because this, by the early 9th century, had become a maritime trading empire, so linking to all the rivers in China and to all the seas, and moving around Southeast Asia and into the Indian Ocean, thousands and hundreds of thousands of Chinese ceramics were moving across the world. And while it's very, very hard for us to understand this today, no one had seen anything like this before. So I'm showing you 3 examples of fish dishes, one with sort of a blue-green glaze, one with a gray-green glaze, and another with more of an olive glaze. And in this hierarchy, the ones that are decorated with the blue-green glaze were seen as the most elaborate. And the one that we have at the Yale Art Gallery, which was a gift from an alumnus, although is on view, but if you can't see it, you can see that it's very unusually got a fish on the bottom as well as the top. So it's really, really fun. These, as I'm sure many of you know, are goldfish. They're auspicious. And they are a common theme in ceramics. I'm showing you now 2 jars, which are kind of fun. They were both about this high. They were probably used initially to move fish brine or star anise or some kind of oil or perfume, and most likely covered with a cloth cover. Because the maritime trade that was uniting the Afro-Asian world at this point of time was carrying a lot of things besides ceramic. It's just that because the clay was so high fired and well glazed, that's what survives in shipwrecks. So we know that these two small jars probably made at two different complexes in Lungchuan. If you look at the bottoms where you can see that one is fired kind of a buffy color and the other has fired a bit more red. These were sourced in the Philippines, again given to Yale by an alumni. And we know these little jars kind of tell a really fun story about how these high-fired, high-glazed ceramics were perceived in other parts of the world in like the 12th to the 13th century. Jars like this, when they were taken to the Philippines, they used up whatever was in them because they were transport jars. Sometimes they then sold them to pharmacies that used them for medicine. Sometimes they buried them for a couple of years. They took them out of the ground, they ground them up, they added other ingredients to them, and they used these clay jars as medicine itself. And that, I think, shows us very, very clearly how this new technology that was evolving in China was blowing people's minds throughout the Afro-Asian world. So this is a good example, I think, of how new technology was being perceived, a long, long time ago, thousands of years ago, and how things that we take for granted today were really extraordinary and miraculous in the 12th and 13th century. The Lungchuan wares are the source of the Western word celadon, which is the term that I'm using generically for the green glazed and relighted ceramics in the volume that we just published. And that's an interesting story. There are two explanations for this Western word. One comes from French, actually. And so in the 18th and 19th century, the French were fascinated by the high-fired porcelains that were coming into Europe finally from China, many of which had beautiful single-color glazes. So they gave them all these romantic names like moonlight or oxblood, and they named the green glazed one Celadon after the character in an 18th century French play whose name was Celadon, and who was a kind of a gesture or a clown, and he wore an outfit that was this kind of gray-green, so they nicknamed these celadons. Prior to that, in the Islamic world, they were avidly collected by a man named Al-Saladin, who was a ruler. I can't remember if it was Egypt or Syria right now. Sorry, I think it was Syria. And he collected them and gave them to other rulers in West Asia as diplomatic gifts. So we think the Western word celadon comes from one of those two sources. But again, you're seeing people around the world reacting to a technology that has its roots in late Tang China. So as the Tang Empire dissolved and China was split into the northern Song and the southern Song, and ultimately into the southern Song, the Song course moved south. The ceramic industry in South China, which is the topic of this book, expanded and expanded and expanded, both for domestic reasons and for trade reasons. And what came into the South and into the ceramic industry with the move of the Southern Court to the South was a taste in a different range of things. So I'm showing you this really wonderful Lungchuan ware Celadon vase. And it is actually based on a Liangju Neolithic jade, which would have been discovered as a type in the northern Song because of the archaeology, particularly in Weizong's court, and then was repurposed in bronze in the northern and southern Song and became a ceramic type in the southern Song and the Yuan dynasty. It's actually kind of fun. You also see things like this sort of Bronze Age period gui, which would have been a storage vessel that got turned into an incense burner in the Lungchuan wares. And you can see that they're not only taking the shape of the earlier gui, but they're also playing with the idea of these vaguely zoomorphic handles. So you have kind of these little dragon figures here and a more pronounced dragon figure here. And the other thing that was coming in as part of this trade that you were finding all over China at this time was imported glass. So this is the Celadon shipwreck. It's one of the more elegant shipwrecks. It was, I guess, founded in the 11th century in Indonesia. And they've done an analysis of where the ceramics were on the ship. And so the green glaze bowls and plates, the celadons that we're talking about, would have been in the bottom of the ship. Because ironically, while some of these things are quite rare now, there were thousands of them that were traveling by sea, and they provided ballast. So ceramics could move. And then glassware, which is this dark blue, would have been much rarer and on the top of the ship. But despite the fact that it was a small part of the cargo, it was being traded to China. Like the small jars that we were looking at a minute ago, these glass bottles or flagons or whatever you want to call it were filled with exotic oils. They were filled with perfume. These ships also had incense, like frankincense from Malaysia or Somalia. I mean, they had tons of things in them. They probably had textiles, but what survives in these shipwrecks largely is the clay. So what I want you to look at is this very, very typical Iraqi, Iranian, Syrian glass form, which then lands up traded to China. So the one on your right was found in the tomb of the Chen princess in the north, and she died in 1018, and then gets transferred and made into a ceramic shape. So you find ceramics in this shape in North China. You actually find them in Korea at this time. And by the time you're in the early 14th century in the south at Luntren, what they have done is they have taken this shape, turned it into a clay shape, and added those dragon or dragonfish handles that we saw on the incense burners originally, which ultimately come from the Great Bronze Age of China. And this really wonderful example, which is actually in the National Museum in Korea, was found on the Hunan shipwreck, which is an early 14th century shipwreck off the coast of Korea that was filled with Chinese ceramics that were intended to go to Japan, but it crashed outside of Korea. And this particular ship was actually supported by two Japanese temples that were trading Chinese ceramics in order to have money for reconstruction of their roofs. So this is a very complicated Pan-Asian story. The other ceramics that are sort of truly mainstream and well-known in scholarship around the world are the Qingbai wares, which were made in Jiangxi. Most Chinese ceramic wares have names that are geographic. So Lungtren is an area, Yue is an old name for that particular part of China. Qingbai wares are named for their color. They basically, as I'm sure you all know, are blue-green white wares. And they are the beginning of the great blue and white porcelain industry that will sweep through China after the 14th century. So after the green glaze wares have had their day. I'm showing you two pieces in the gallery. One on your left, I was particularly fascinated with for two reasons. One, I couldn't find another example of it anywhere, which is unusual because usually ceramics are made in multiples. And two, it took me a very long time to figure out what it was. My theory at the moment, and it is a theory, is that this is a flower pot or a pot for growing a bulb. And that's because it's not a functional thing. It's fairly small. I think the source was this kind of glass beaker that was made in Roman and West Asian glass that was also being found in China in some numbers because of the lobing. But while you can imagine drinking from the glass beaker, you can't really imagine drinking from something like this with this wonderful foliate rim. So after showing it to about 20 people and thinking about it for about 2 years, I've decided that it's a bulb or a flower pot. But if anybody disagrees, let me know. I could be wrong. So Qingbai wares went from being sort of this kind of very delicate white color to being more of this blue-green color, which matches the most famous blue-green color that you find in Lungtran wares and was the color of sort of the preferred color at the time. Again, they made incense burners, which is what this little wonderful duck thing is, and cups for drinking. I think it's important to understand the reason both Lungchuan and Qingbai kilns were making so many incense burners was because so much imported aromatics, both woods and resins, were being brought into China at this point in time. So there were over 1,000 caddies, 100,000 caddies brought in 1131 by one trader from the Arab world, talking about frankincense. And I'm talking about frankincense because having grown up in the West, I'm well familiar with the story of the three kings and the gifts of frankincense, incense, and myrrh. Frankincense is from Somalia. So there were over 100,000 caddies brought to the Chinese court in 1131 and over 300,000 caddies brought to the Chinese court in 1136. And that's only one kind of aromatic that was being used in China at the court, in homes, during rituals, and to perfume clothing. So one of the things you find in the ceramic industry at this time, particularly for domestic use or use in sort of a broader East Asian world, is an enormous number of incense burners. And this duck shape is just really wonderful because there's a bowl supporting a lotus, supporting a bod, and which a little duck shape comes out. And you can imagine the smoke wafting from the mouth of the duck and from these two holes here. This is truly, truly kind of fun. I'd love to own this. It doesn't belong to Yale. It belongs to the Art Institute of Chicago. The other thing that's interesting about the ceramic industry in the South as it was booming is that they made a certain amount of Buddhist art, particularly in the late Southern Song and in the Yuan dynasty under the Mongols. And both of these lovely bodhisattvas are wearing a type of jewelry that derives from Tibetan or Indo-Himalayan traditions, particularly this kind of girdle that you're seeing on both of them, and this sweeping jewelry, and the elaborate crowns, and the earrings, really beautiful things. And both the Qingbai and the Lungchuan kilns made these, but there were more at Qingbai. Probably the most well-known example of a Qingbai ware in Europe is the small vase that I'm showing you on your left. And this is a really fascinating story. So if you're wondering why we're not talking about Europe yet, it's because the maritime trade that's uniting the African and the East Asian worlds, or the west coast of Africa and Japan, was not reaching Europe yet. That's only going to happen a couple of centuries later when a Portuguese explorer called Vasco da Gama manages to round the Cape of Good Hope. So he figures out how to sail around the African continent, and then European ships can move into this sort of Persian Gulf, Indian Ocean, South China Sea trade. And then they kind of horn in, frankly, but they start becoming part of this global trade in Chinese ceramics. This vase probably traveled overland, and we know a great deal about its history. It's called the Gagnier's Fontil vase. For those of you that have read earlier scholarship, it used to just be called the Fontil vase. But then the French realized that it had been in French hands as well, so they made everybody change the name, hence Gagnier's Fontil vase. It's actually in the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin. And we know that sometime around 1338, this lovely Qingbai vase was given by a delegate from the Yuan Mongol court to Pope Benedict II. Pope Benedict II gave it to a ruler in Hungary. And because nobody knew exactly what this was, and it seemed so rare and exotic, nobody saw it as functional. They saw it as something you displayed and showed off. So the Hungarian king, I'm going to spare you all the names, who owned it very briefly, had it mounted with gold and silver. And this is what it looked like when he had it mounted for display. And we know who he is because this is his coat of arms. He eventually gave it to Louis the Great. It then got moved around diplomatically in Europe. It landed up in the hands of the son of the French Sun King, Versailles. I am the sun, I am the state, I'm the god. His son gave it to a gentleman named Gagnier. Mr. Gagnier allowed his valet to sketch the piece with its mounts. It then disappeared from view for a while, showed up at Fonthill Abbey in England, was sold in auction in the late 19th century, and then landed up in the National Museum of Ireland. So because it had these paintings of this mounts, unlike most ceramics, which are very hard to trace in history, this one has a great story. And this is the first, or one of the very few examples of Chinese green glazed porcelain wares that were starting to trickle into Europe in the late 14th, mid 14th century. There were few more pieces that came in, again, largely overland, largely as diplomatic gifts from Islamic courts in the 15th and 16th centuries. And then once global trade began, it wasn't, one piece of Chinese clay here and one piece of Chinese clay there. It was hundreds of thousands that started coming into Europe. So this is the sort of mainstream story. Then we've got all the funky stuff that's in the Yale University Art Gallery. So we're moving to the Southwest. We're looking at Hunan. And I did want to remind you that Hunan has always been part of global trade, and they're famous for their changsha wares, which were an important aspect of trade in Chinese clay in the 9th century. But as these green glazed wares from the east coast of China became, or the southeast seaboard, if you prefer, became more prominent, changsha wares disappear in Yunnan. And they start having smaller kiln sentences that are making things that are supposed to look like Qingbai ware or supposed to look like Lungchun ware. Much smaller production, many fewer pieces, but you can see that this has the sort of light green-white glaze, and this has a more olivey glaze. You find the same thing in the Guangzhou region. Again, there's mixed kiln production. So unlike these centers in Zhejiang and Jiangxi, where they're really making one kind of thing over and over again, these smaller kiln complexes in Guangzhou are really trying to stay with the market. One of the things that happens is that they make a lot of jars that are not necessarily the highest end, but they're intended for transport. So you would take a small jar like this and you would put you could put smaller clay items in it. You could put gold and silver items in it. You could put something like star anise or a kind of oil or mercury or something that was also being traded, so the jar is more functional. And this is a fun piece because it's in the Yale collection, and I finally identified it by looking at the storage jars in this Belitung shipwreck, which is an early 19th century shipwreck in Indonesia, and thinking, although there's some controversy, that probably this ship sailed from Guangzhou and that they were sourcing the jars for the storage of food or what foodstuffs or whatever you wanted in that area. There's also a kiln in Guangzhou that's playing with kind of the idea of whitewares, which is called the Sichuan kiln. So you can see a phoenix head d'or and again a cup and a saucer. If you look very carefully in the inside of the cup, you can see these kind of very sickle cell, like very simple lines, and that's very, very typical of ceramics from South China, particularly Guangzhou and Fujian. If you get sort of away from the southwest of Guangzhou and you move to the northeast of this province, you can see that the kilns there are far more aware of what was happening sort of further east. So this is from the Meishan kilns, and they are famous because they tried to copy the Yue wares in Zhejiang that were causing such a furor, the secret color wares, the how did they do this? And you can see that if you look very carefully at this very, very pretty, elegant dish, you can see a couple of things. One, the green isn't quite as gray as what you were finding in the other kilns. And two, the glaze is not as well controlled. So it's a little bit more modeled. So they don't have quite either they don't have the right clay, or they don't have the right recipe for glaze, or they don't have the glaze and the firing as well balanced, but they're making things that are selling widely throughout Asia, but really don't look like the originals. And they are also starting to make in that area a great many Qingbai type wares. So this is the inside of a bowl, and this is the outside of a bowl. Again, you can see those sketchy lines that are typical. I think this is probably either the leaves of a banana or a plantain plant. A couple of things to notice. This, again, the glaze is not as quite as well controlled. So that's why when I looked at something like this in the storage, when I first got to Yale, I was like, oh, I don't know what that is. That doesn't look quite right. And so it's, you know, it doesn't hold during the firing. And actually this clay is a lot more brittle and not as well refined as some of the other things. But there's very clearly in China at this point in time, an awareness of what's being made throughout the South and a willingness to sort of be in dialogues with kilns elsewhere. So one of the things you find over and over again are these fish dishes. I showed you the Lungchuan examples. So this is a fish dish from the Guangdong region, couple of things, same kind of goldfish. They're a little bit further apart, and there's much more decoration in the interior of the dish than you would find in one that was made in the kilns further east. Fujian's fascinating. Initially, Guangzhou is the primary port. By the 12th to the 14th century, Fujian has taken over as the primary port. That is the reason why there's still a lot of monuments to Hinduism and Islam in that province, because there were so many foreign traders coming in, settling there and being part of these sort of, I guess I can't say global yet, international networks of traders. And as was true in Guangzhou and in Hunan, the Fujian kilns really began to try to play with some of the ideas that had developed in Yuan Lungchuan. So you get these green glaze wares that are very, very similar to the Lungchuan wares. In general, the Fujian wares, when they are decorated, as you can see here, a little bit more elaborately decorated. Some that are very, very, very sketchy in their decoration, both in the interior and the exterior. As was true in Guangzhou and Yunnan, we are not in a situation where a kiln complex or kiln complexes are making only one type of ware. They're making multiple types of ware, possibly to respond to the market. So in Fujian, they also made Qingbai type wares. Again, the glazes aren't quite as well controlled, and they're usually a little bit more elaborately decorated. The reason the rim is not decorated on this piece is because there was such an extensive demand for ceramics in China at this point in time, in China and throughout the Afro-Asian world, as I'm calling it, that they found a way of firing them more quickly if they fired them on the rims. So they fired them upside down. So they fired them that way, and then they would add a bronze or a silver or a gold rim to the vessel to hide the fact that it wasn't completely glazed. And you see that in a lot of Southern Sung and Yuan ceramics. Fujian also started making, possibly in response to Qingbai wares, these kind of white wares that are called dewa wares. So they're a little on the green side. They're very, very distinctive. You have a little box here and a jar. These in the 18th century become one of the most famous Chinese ceramics, and because everybody gave Chinese ceramics French names at that time, for reasons I still don't understand, they're called blanc de Chine. But the funky little jar with the really bad picture that I'm showing you is there because that is known in Western scholarship as the Marco Polo jar. So it's an example of a dewa ware from Fujian province. It is in the treasury of San Marco in Venice. And the story is that Marco Polo brought it back with his travels. It was, again, this extremely exotic element that no one had ever seen in Europe. But from the standpoint of Chinese history, is kind of it's a nice little trade jar. The interesting story is that the Western word for white glazed high fired clays, which is porcelain, is supposed to have come from Marco Polo. Because when he saw these little clay jars in Fujian, he didn't know what they were. Because again, we take this for granted, but no one had seen this stuff before. So he thought it looked like the inside of a cowrie shell. which is called a porcellana in Italian. And so he dubbed this clay porcelain, and we still use that word today. And there were also kilns in the south of Fujian making things for trade largely to the sort of mainland and island Southeast Asia. One of the things they made a great deal of are these vessels called kendi, which were intended specifically for the Southeast Asian market. And they're actually drinking vessels as well as pouring vessels. So even though this is extremely awkward to all of us, you would hold the vessel by the neck, put it up against your head, and then dribble the water into your mouth. And these are, again, just other examples of these often overlooked but really fun little storage jars that were being made all throughout China for trade at this point in time. So ceramics are these Chinese ceramics are being made in millions. They're traveling on ships in thousands or hundreds of thousands. They're sort of trickling throughout the world. And they spur responses in other industries. So Vietnam, which you know has a very, very complicated history with China and was under Chinese control in the Han and the Tang dynasties. In the sort of 10th to the 14th century, when it was an independent entity, really had an explosion of the ceramic industry. So they started making things that responded to their own shapes. This is a Bronze Age vessel from Vietnam, and this is a jar in the Yale collection that is a jar made in the shape as that Bronze Age vessel. One of the things that you're going to see starting in Vietnam is a different way of decorating the surface of a ceramic. So this is inlaid with a slip. I gotta hurry up. These are more Vietnamese things. Again, playing with the idea of the two fish dish. Again, more like what you would find in Canton or in Fujian, in that they're decorating the dish more. Thailand also has a green glazed ceramic industry. One of the most famous in the world is the Korean. In the 12th to the 14th century, although these were never trade goods, so they were always domestic goods, the Chinese were collecting Korean ceramics. So there are about 16 examples that have been excavated from high-ranking Chinese tombs. And there's a lot of Chinese scholarship about Korean celadons, usually referring to them as having the radiance of jade and the clarity of water, first under the heavens. Interestingly enough, in terms of the kind of clays used in Korea at this time and the color of the glazes, they are the ones that are the closest to the Yuewares that are the starting point for our story. And then we get to Japan, which, as I mentioned, was very, very involved in trading with China and also in selling Chinese ceramics. And over the time, all of the ceramics that are found everywhere else in the world are found in Japan. They're better preserved in Japan. So just for the fun, I'm showing you this 14th century detail from a 14th century painting that's a hand scroll. That's the biography of this very bored looking monk. And you can see this is actually a poetry contest. This is a famous Japanese poet. He's got a Chinese, probably Lungchen ware as his incense burner here. So the kinds of things we were seeing before. And you can see that the kitchen is filled with red and black lacquer and more green glaze ceramics. And there was, as was true in Vietnam and Thailand and elsewhere, an awareness of the Chinese ceramic industry and a desire to respond to it within the Japanese ceramic industry. But since we've got a little bit of time, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what happened to Chinese ceramics in Japan, because Japan is honestly Asia's attic, ATTIC, not addict. There are more things preserved there than there are in other countries, and we know more about how they were repurposed. So the slide on your right is actually a burial that was placed in a mound with Chinese Buddhist texts written on it to preserve them during bad times for various reasons. So the jar is a classic Chinese storage jar that then became this sacred item. The little box that I'm showing you here is again from China, probably started its life as a cosmetic box. By the time it gets to Japan, it's a reliquary. So it was found with little beads in it, symbolizing the relics of the Buddha. The mirror is also from China. The knife and the sutra container are Japanese. So here's what happened. All these Chinese ceramics are coming in through basically one port. They're trickling through the court. They're being found in monasteries, and they become part of elite culture in Japan. At the same time, the Japanese are becoming more and more fascinated with the formalized drinking of tea, which is what we call the tea ceremony, which was also practiced in China. And some of these really humble Chinese ceramics become extremely important cultural properties. So this is a Chinese storage jar. It's a storage jar. It's a transport jar. It's not a high-end trade item. It was used to move something else. We're still trying to figure out if it was made in Guangzhou or Fujian. But it lands up in Japan. By the 16th century, it's in the hands of a gentleman who's very involved with the Japanese tea ceremony. And over time, it acquires 3 boxes. It acquires a host of writing about it, and it acquires clothes. So this jar, which is now in DC, is known as chigusa, which is myriad flowers, myriad grasses. We can document it back to the 16th century, and it's got 2 sets of Chinese silk cords. And this is typical of what happened to these ceramics made in Fujian, but elsewhere in China, that landed up in Japan and got preserved and documented because of the tea ceremony. So one of the things we know that was happening is that when ceramics moved over the seas, sometimes they were assembled in crates. So these are the objects that were in one crate in the Hunan shipwreck. And you can see that there's a very similar storage jar. There's a mortar and pestle. There's incense burners, and there's these tea bowls. These are tea measures, which are these sort of brown glazed or black glazed things from Fujian, which are called genware. And actually, the chemistry or the technology that you need to make a green glaze, which has to do with manipulating copper, is the same technology that you need to make a tea bowl. And in China, in these kilns, in Fujian, which you know is famous for its tea, they started making these brown glazed bowls and making the glaze, making certain things pop out of the glaze as they were heated, which they referred to as, in this case, hare's fur. So several of these tea bowls landed up in Japan. And these are types of Fujianware that you don't find anywhere else in the world. So the one on your left is called an it's not called a hare's fur, it's called an iridescent spotted. And the one on your right is called an oil spotted. Both are in Japanese collections. Both have very long lineages, so we know all about them. And the one on your right also has its 3 different Chinese lacquers that would be used in different contexts in the tea ceremony. And what's fascinating about these 2 tea bowls is that in Japan, they are listed as national treasures. So the Japanese have this arts hierarchy that they started in the 1950s, where they took certain things in their culture that were either extraordinarily beautiful or historically important, or both. And they designated them as national treasures. There are 17 ceramics in Japan that are designated as national treasures. 5 of them are Fujian tea bowls. 3 of them are Lungtron wares, and 1 is a ceramic from Korea. And I see this as kind of a brilliant paradigm for everything that happened as the Chinese ceramic industry evolved in the South and became part of a global dialogue and remains so today. So thank you for your attention. I very much appreciate it. And happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic.